All right, let's continue then to dissect the day's issues and the ANC's celebrations, but of course the President's speech as well as the state of the ANC and their issues in general. And we have via Skype political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Thank you so very much, Ms. Naidu, for joining us here on SABC News.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to share my views.
You're welcome. You know, I've heard so many political analysts throughout the day saying that there was nothing new or fresh coming out of President Ramaphosa's speech today. Would you sort of share the same sentiment?
I think it was a standard speech, particularly because what you're seeing here is a speech that had to be something that either he had to whip out something really creative, or to go with the standard line of hope, fuel, a capable state, fighting corruption, ensuring that Eskom doesn't lose more capacity and more credibility. And of course, he has also to make sure that it's the ANC, the party in power, and the party that's the governing government in power, that remains front and center as the delivery of this. Now, right now, we're sitting in a situation where momentum, mood, etc., with regard to credibility of the party, credibility of the state, credibility of the government is not very high, I would assume. And I suspect, looking at some of the survey polls that will come out, will suggest that people are not feeling very confident, very jubilant about what's going on in the country right now. And it doesn't help when you actually look at the indicators that have come out regarding our unemployment rate, which is touching just under 30%, which in unofficial terms, I think it doesn't bode well for us. So I think the speech was one to inspire, but I was left that inspired.
And now this is Ramaphosa's third January 8th statement. At this time, what should we then be sort of expecting? I mean, it does seem that he did touch on all the topics we could have expected him to touch on. I mean, he touched on Eskom, land, corruption. It seems that he touched a bit on everything as one would have hoped for. What exactly then was missing from the speech then?
I think for me, the bottom line was decisiveness, decisive action, capability, capacity. These are phrases we've heard so many times in the past. Cohesion, building, social cohesion, building statehood, confidence. The party will deliver. I just caught a bit of the interview with your reporter on SABC Now with the president, and he keeps talking about some of the anger that he felt, the disillusionment he felt with regard to the way in which services have not been rolled out in particular areas, and he's upset about that. But he says at the same time, it's the ANC that's going to deliver. Well, that's the crisis for me. The crisis for me is what is going to be decisive action. You're either going to have a slow drip and play within the confines of what you say, and what you see are the structural conditions within the party that will not enable you to be decisive, or you need to basically step out and say, I'm not really worried about what kind of consequences I'm going to see, but I'm going to be decisive and I'm going to take action, and it's not a slow drip. I'm going to operate in a way where I'm going to make some heads roll. And I don't think I've seen that in some of the argument that's coming forward. Yes, we see Kusatu stepping up and saying, the rest of the board of Eskom must resign. We've seen other issues come to the fore with regard to questions of what's happening in the Middle East, etc. But we have a crisis in South Africa. And if you're going to grow then less than 1% or even less than 0.9%, etc., and if our unemployment is sitting at its current state, and we're going to add more to our unemployment state of affairs with new matriculants coming into, new qualified grade 12s coming into the economy that's going to create more pressure, that also frightens me. So I think decisiveness was what needed to be, and it wasn't there.
I mean, I find it so interesting that you use the word decisiveness, and this is one word that's been ringing quite a bit throughout the day. My colleague Mzwambeja was speaking with the president shortly, and he went and touched on the issue of indecision, and that some people are saying that we have a president who is indecisive, and this reflects on what you're saying. The president then defended himself by saying that he's not a dictatorial president. What do you make of that defense coming from the president? He says he consults, he talks to people. He doesn't just make a decision on his own. This is how the president just now defended himself. What do you then make of that, Sanusha?
For me personally, I think you've got to be careful in thinking that decisiveness is one of dictatorialism. I don't think it's one of the same. I think we've got to be very careful in lumping the two words as interchangeable. No, consultation is important. Having a decision-making process where you get all the relevant information, you get all the relevant assessments and issues that are put forward. And at the end of the day, it's the president that has to decide that. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of the decisiveness. We're not saying he needs to be dictatorial. We're not saying that he needs to basically ignore advice at his peril. But what we're saying is that you need to be decisive in some of the actions that are taken. For example, I'm not sure what's going to happen with regard to the Zondo Commission and after its lifespan has come to an end. Because you also need to make heads roll. You need to tell people at the most basic level of your participation at the grassroots that you're not going to tolerate the kinds of level of corruption that is happening. And I think for me, we've become almost just go with the flow. We've become almost complacent about the fact that these things happen. No. We need decisiveness to say, we're not going to let it happen. This is not the way things are. We're going to do things differently.
I mean, there was a pointed question about the support which the ANC still sort of enjoys. And, the president spoke about the fact that, the ANC still enjoys a great deal of confidence amongst South Africans. And then there was a question that was pointed to him by my colleague, Mzwambeje, saying that, it's been 25 years and, the ANC seems to sort of rely on the fact that there's this liberation movement. And indeed, the president says that, yes, you can mention the 25 years that we've been in power, but people do say that the ANC has changed their lives. How long can the ANC rely on this sort of talk or this sort of praise without sort of dealing with the main issues? When we're talking about service delivery and those issues that people continue to fight about when it comes to the ANC, can the ANC continue to rely on the fact that they're seen as this liberation movement, the fact that there are certain people who say that the ANC changed their lives? The ANC at this point should be looking at a way to change course.
Absolutely. I think the narrative of rhetoric and saying that the ANC has changed lives, we can't deny that. That is not what we are disputing. I think ANC in power have changed lives. But we also got to remember that if you're looking at the base from which we have come from apartheid to where we are now, people's lives have changed. Access to resources have been created. People have been able to access social grants. They've been able to access universities. There's a whole lot of interesting structural and socioeconomic changes that have taken place. But it's not enough. Now, why isn't it enough? It's not enough because our structural conditions are expanding, and we are expanding at a rapid rate. And it creates more pressure on the services that the government needs to roll out. And that comes to the point you're making about how long can you use the rhetoric of we've changed lives, and when does that start to seep out of in terms of the holes that narrative and rhetoric will have. And this is precisely why, because it's not a sustainable way of trying to defend yourself, nor is it a sustainable way to measure yourself. I think what's important here is to be able to say, well, how do we deal with the endemic crises that are actually crippling the state? And one of those endemic crises that are crippling the state is the fact that people are not making the money that they want and therefore using the party as an accumulation of wealth and so forth. So it becomes an instrument of vested interest. How do you deal with people who are supposed to be serving and selflessly serving people and not selfishly serving themselves?
All right, Sanusha, great pleasure having you with us. Thank you so very much for your insightful views. Let's leave it there. That's Sanusha Naidu, political analyst, giving us some of her views on today's speech by the ANC president as the ANC celebrates 108 years. All right, of course, the question of the day then. Today, we are asking you for your reaction on ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech at the party's 108th celebrations in Kimberley in the Northern Cape. Let's listen in on some of the voice notes we've already received.
Well, I think the ANC is just building up on more and more lies. They're just not being realistic. They just don't want to get straight to the point that they're just having a very big crisis with Eskom. So they just keep on making up empty promises, of which it's going to make the party have much bigger problems than the ones that they have.
Good afternoon. It's Lololekiso in Vandersburg. The president has said much during the statement, the 8th statement. But my concern or my applaud is his promise that Eskom will not be privatized. And for the fact that he has took, or the ANC has took it initiative that it will save ANC, I believe that the president will do that. Thank you.
All right. I also want to take a look at some of the tweets that we've been receiving then. Good for a struggling governing party. Regular words were used and all we can do is wait for action to be done. How, when still remains a question to be answered. Of course, you can also interact with me. You can see my handle there at FloLadwaba1. The speech was good, but it's not the time for speeches. It is time for delivering to the poor of the poorest in South Africa. Of course, those hashtags coming in, hashtag ANC 108, hashtag SABC News, and of course hashtag full view. So those are some of the tweets that we are then receiving. Please continue to keep them coming. I'll of course take time to read them on air.